This is Don Grede, and you're listening to the Matt Balaker podcast.
Thank you, everyone, for once again tuning into the Matt Balaker podcast and giving me a purpose in life. I really appreciate it. I'm enthused about today's guest. He's a gentleman and a scholar, an investor, advisor, and a business supermodeler. I'm going to anoint him America's unofficial dean of cannabis studies. Please welcome Don Grede to the show. How are you doing, Don?
I'm well, Matt. Thank you for that mellifluous introduction. I hope I prove worthy.
Mellifluous. I can tell you have some education behind your words. So I'm curious, Don. You've taken a kind of a non-traditional career path, but where did it begin?
Well, I came out of banking. I knocked around the banking communities of Milwaukee and Boston for a while. Ended up at MIT Sloan School studying marketing, surprisingly. I thought I wanted to be a little more well-rounded.
Yeah. How does a marketing major fit in with all those eggheads at MIT?
Well, yeah, exactly. Well, what I was seeing was an incredible revolution in desktop computing and moving to more productivity in the office. And I said, these are new products, and my egghead classmates are going to create them, but somebody better know how to sell them. And I didn't know much about the inner workings. I knew how to drive the car and not, build the engine. So that's really what I thought I would be doing. And I went into I was recruited by a consulting firm that sort of took me in that direction, and I appreciated it. They had a lot of large clients like Levi's and Burlington, Cannon Mills, and Carhartt, and I got to work on some really interesting marketing projects, but they weren't very tech savvy. The company I worked for was not very tech savvy, and I wanted to do something a little bit more forward. So I started at tech firms, and that really got my entrepreneurial juices flowing because I learned what it was like to raise your own capital and build your own business.
Yeah, and what is it like to raise your own capital and build your own business?
This is my obvious segue into cannabis, because coming into the cannabis industry, I came in as sort of a venture capitalist. I had some tech stuff I'd invested in, and we were doing a high-tech air conditioning and portable cooling units in big buildings that had lost their AC and that sort of thing. And I started getting calls from growers. Gosh, and this was all the way back in 2011. So,
wait, time out. How would growers know to call you, Don? Just curious.
I had a fairly high profile for a number of reasons in the Colorado, particularly Denver, Boulder corridor. I was doing a lot of consulting to new businesses at the Cannabis, at Canopy Boulder, and at the C-Tech startups. And so I was mentoring some companies, and sort of word got out, and a lot of the new companies were in cannabis, and clearly we're birthing a new industry. And we move, and we'll talk about that as we get into the evolution of our industry.
Yeah, but I want to pause just briefly, Don, because you had a very kind of buttoned up white shoe MIT background. You started in marketing for these large companies. What was the reputational risk when you joined the cannabis industry initially? Well, I mean, because you were someone, you actually had other options. It wasn't like it was this or nothing.
I got into it because, I got involved with ArcView, and I assume you know what that is, but for your listeners, it's really an organization dedicated to finding the right companies to invest in. And the ArcView members are typically accredited investors. And so I joined, and I helped a few cannabis businesses get started, but it's what I wanted to do because I was not all that buttoned up a businessman. I was the dope smoking MIT. And sort of the dichotomy, I was called the sport coat wearing cannabis man when I got into this, but I'm not really that. It was sort of more a labor of, I like startups, I like early stage businesses, and the whole industry was that. And I said, boy, this is where I belong. And it seemed like a lot of companies needed adult supervision, and I had the gray hair to at least present some gravitas at meetings, few presentations, and that sort of thing. So we did have a pretty good time birthing some companies, and I was involved in the investment end of a few. But we were a little early. I helped write some regulations for our industry here in Colorado in 2012, and immediately got involved in, of all things, branding cannabis brands. And as they say, pioneers get the arrows and settlers get the land. I was clearly in the pioneer category and got a lot of arrows. So we learned a lot of stuff because branding was way too early back then.
Yeah. What are some of the sharper arrows that you took?
Well, learning that timing is everything. And the birthing of any state's cannabis industry is chaotic at best. And honestly, you have things going in fits and starts where dispensaries would have enormous expenses before they had any revenue because they had to get a customer base geared to, they had to pay rent, they had to hire and train people in a new industry. Meanwhile, the cultivators were experimenting with ways to get massive grows going, not always successfully, having a lot of bad harvests. So we had a lot of mediocre product when the doors opened, and we were trying to sell that at right rates without losing customer base and putting people off to cannabis in general. So we were sort of in a place where everything's going sort of in the right direction, but at different fits and starts. And all of that, of course, cost money. So all of our original investment plans had to be tweaked, and we had to go back to our investors. And I cannot tell you how many checks I had to write that I didn't want to, but it all seemed to sort of level out at a place. And what's so funny, Matt, is that every state that I go into has different tweaks to the problem, but the same general problems. Where a new state, and we'll get to New Jersey in a minute, I can see it happening there. Even the MSOs that are going to come in and grow in New Jersey, yeah, they're talented growers. You got new soils, new air quality, new water mixes, everything. We cannot expect perfect harvests. So to build business forecasts and not build that in is foolish. And I have currently 7 clients there. So I was sort of in the process of trying to educate them about how, like combat, once the first shot is fired, everything goes to hell and you have to regroup. And that's what this industry is going to be, make no mistake. So anyway, getting just back to the entry in the business, in 2012, when the voters voted for legal weed here, we weren't ready for it at all. And it took us a year and a month to get ready. And then January 1st, the first stores opened in 2014. And they weren't ready, but at least we got some legal weed on the street. People started to understand this is a birthing process. We're just getting walking in. We didn't want to charge $30 a gram, but the cannabis growers were being really difficult. And what we found over the first year or two was that that dynamic started to change. And where cultivators certainly control the process, control the supply chain early on, by year 2 or year 3, they're fighting for shelf space with the dispensaries. So the dispensaries are more in control. And of course, they always were destined to be because they control the final transaction with the end user. So I see no different in any state that I've worked in, and now I've worked in about a half dozen, and New Jersey's no different.
Yeah, so you mentioned you've worked in a half dozen states. What, you don't have to list all 6, but what are some of the states you've worked in?
Well, in Oregon, I have an ongoing client that I love this company. It's called Smokies, and they sell gummies, and they've done it very interestingly. And I was contracted just to help them proliferate the brand. So I brought it into Colorado, into California. We work in Illinois. We had some false starts in Michigan and Missouri. We're going big guns in Oklahoma, and we'll be bringing them into New Jersey. So that was just a branding play. And because as I referenced early on, way back in the early days in 2014, I was involved too early in a branding play, but those arrows proved to be beneficial with this project that I'm working with Smokies. I did some work for a big grow plant in California where we were going to build, still are, going to build 10 100,000 foot grows and lease them. All this is on an Indian reservation outside of San Diego. It's very susceptible to exactly what we want to do. It just post-COVID, we're just getting it back up and running now. Did some work for a client in Oklahoma, in Illinois, currently working in Michigan, and as I said earlier, New Jersey, and that's kind of spilling over into New York.
Okay. And I like the term laboratories of democracy for states.
Okay.
And California came on early, at least on the medical side, and then Colorado was one of the first adult use, and now it seems like more states are, changing the rules pretty much daily. In your opinion, Don, what states have really screwed up, and what states have screwed up less, in your opinion?
Well, I'm glad you said it that way, because they've all screwed up. And no one could expect to get it right the first time. We knew that in Colorado. Many people have heard this name, but Matt Cook was sort of the guru that headed up the regulatory committee. And Matt's an ex-cop. He'd spent quite a number of years sort of sorting out the legal gambling industry here for us, so he was an obvious choice. And he did a very smart thing. He instituted what we call sunshine laws, where we revisit the regulations every 6 months. So we knew we were going to screw up. How can we tweak it? And we had to have a mechanism in place to do that. The states that did that did well.
That's smart.
They could fix it. I think Washington was sort of a mess going in. They tried to too heavily regulate it. Unfortunately, well, I think they've sorted all that out now, but they didn't do it right going in, and it sort of created a lot more chaos than needed to be had. Oregon did it right. They just had a much more laissez-faire attitude about it. Illinois did it completely wrong. The states that try and have too much government control of this, too much regulation, they get it wrong. And what Illinois did was only allow 37 they have 37 counties, I think that's the number. And so they only allowed 38 cultivation licenses. We're going to have one in every county and 2 in Cook County, for where Chicago is. Well, that's all well and good. Now let's build the market. So this was just medical. They did that first. In medical cannabis, you have to have a card to buy cannabis. And to get a card, you have to have a certain illness, malady, health problem. Well, they restricted that to only about 4 things. And it turned out only 3,000 people had these things that would allow them to get a card. And the whole market died right there. How can we build them? With 3,000 as a whole market in Illinois, how can we build a market? So they did it wrong. Took a year to correct it. Just more political stuff. Oklahoma did it right. They left hands off. I think.
And Oklahoma, that's a much more recent adopter. I think, was it 2020?
Yeah, they just went. But it was amazing how the regulators said, just let it be. Let it go. And it's funny because the regulatory system is either the government hands it off to the liquor board, to the revenue guys, or to the health guys. Mm-hmm. Those that hands it off to the health guys don't give.
You can cuss if you want.
They don't care about cannabis as a business. It's just, is it healthy? That's cover their ass. Mm-hmm. All right. The liquor board is sort of in the middle. The guys that hand it off to the revenuers, those guys get it. Because if there's a drug for politicians, it's money. And once they see the fees and taxes coming in, Hickenlooper was a perfect example. He was a lot of hand wringing and let's see what the federal government does and all. And as soon as he started getting those checks, he said, "Wow, look what we did here, aren't we?" And all the data about possible additional use by kids and all, none of that worked. There's no more crime. Under 21-year-olds, cannabis use went down. So all this stuff that they were worried about, it isn't there.
It's like the forbidden fruit. Once it's legal, the kids are like, I don't want to do this anymore. It's boring. My parents and grandparents are doing it.
Oh, I saw it. My daughter was in high school at the time, and I saw it right there. Needless to say, I'd show up to pick her up at high school, and people would know what I did. I got some very weird questions that I had to bounce, but
what was some of the reaction to
Sorry.
from family and friends when you're now in this seedy business.
Oh shit, we expected it.
Okay.
It was only a matter of time. No, I don't really ever worry about that. I mean, my folks sort of knew I was a weed guy back in college. So coming out of MIT, there was no one in my class at MIT that didn't know that a bunch of us, and I among them, smoked. So it wasn't a surprise to anybody. And I don't really do it that much anymore, but it was just a matter of, I was with a lot of guys, a bunch of them cops and ex-Army Reserve people that just felt this is a matter of personal freedom. It isn't a matter of just getting whacked. It's really about that personal choice.
That's a good point. And you mentioned, Don, there are kind of three main phases of cannabis industry development. We touched on legalization, but what else?
Legalization, all the stuff I talked about fits and starts. I think we now have enough models to choose from. So the 18th state is New Jersey. The 18th state to go adult rec is New Jersey. So they have all these models to choose from. And during legalization, it was actually kind of funny because I actually brought some folks, did the cannabis tour of Colorado and said, this is how we work here. And a lot of that stuff was adopted in Alaska. Uruguay was a big one. My Spanish was pretty awful, but I did squire some Uruguayans around Denver and Boulder for a few days, and they actually did adopt some of our regs. And true in Oklahoma. I won't talk about Illinois anymore, but just suffice it to say it didn't work there. But there's enough models we can now choose from what's working and what's not, that New Jersey regulators are very smart to that. We're not worrying about that so much more. So I think the regulatory time frame of 1 year to build the regs is still in place, but there won't be so much tweaking afterwards because they'll get it right the first time. So that's all really I wanted to say about the legalization phase. As we bring more and more states on board with legalization, there's models that work. And we've now seen, we're past that stage. That's sort of the agrarian phase of American life. We're now into the Industrial Revolution, or what I'll call the metaphor.
I love your historical analogies.
The second phase is clearly product differentiation. Everybody thought cannabis, well, there'd be a bunch of dope smokers. Well, people like me that smoked at one time, but really, I've never smoked cigarettes. So it's not a particular way I want to have cannabis in my body. We started seeing the proliferation of shatter and oils, and then ultimately butter and chocolates and edibles. And finally, we got smart here in Colorado and learned the labeling game, so that all these just really awful stories about overdoses and everything went away, and we now really know how to consume cannabis orally.
What do you think led to the reduction in cannabis overdoses in Colorado?
Oh, I think it's product packaging and labeling. This is not something, you can't take cannabis orally and expect it to hit you like it would in your lungs if you were smoking. So once people learn that, they say, well, how do I do this? Because I take it and 15 minutes later, I expect to be high and I'm not, so I better take some more. Well, it's what happened in the early phase here. By the time 45 minutes or so, the first round was going to kick in. They had 3 doses in them and they were whacked. And they said, I never want to do this again. Or worse, they did harmful things. And so for a while, this was all pulled back off the shelf. And if you remember, Dixie Elixirs was a great company, and they had to pull thousands of bottles off shelves to relabel them because infused beverages was one of the things that was a problem. So once they got the labeling right and said, look, honestly, take 10 milligrams and wait 40 minutes and take another one, fine, or not, but don't mess around with it. And then we got into labeling. People said, yes, now I want to buy chocolate bars. I want to buy oils to cook with. I want to buy butters. I want to consume this orally. it created a much bigger market for women, surprisingly, if you follow the demographics. And it sort of leads us to what I'm going to call the third phase of the industry. But we now see first-time trials heavily favor women. They're heavily buying into non-smokable products. And we're seeing now, if you take any given month, the mix of products across the country is smokables are really in the minority. They're in the 40s somewhere, but we're looking at 55-45 in favor of non-smokables. And I think that's an evolution that I won't say we weren't ready for it, but we weren't sure how that was going to play out. And as a result of that, we're reaching now what I think is just the start of a third phase, where people are starting to view this as part of everyday life. It's no big deal to go to a cocktail party here in Colorado, and there's a bowl of joints there, and people are outside and smoking and the party, and not looking over their shoulder anymore, not realizing this is no longer an arrestable offense. And I use that as an example of there's ways that people want to use topicals and oral doses in their everyday life, sort of as part of their wellness program. And as an example, and I will segue this into New Jersey now, we are in a place where New Jersey is hitting the ground running with this kind of model. I have a client there who, from the outset, said she wanted to apply for a license in a market that accepts cannabis lounges, which I digress for a minute. Cannabis lounges are still a very new and regulated thing in a state like Colorado, who's now had legal adult rec cannabis for almost 10 years. We still haven't sorted out how we're going to deal with cannabis lounges. We can't have a windowless, linoleum-floored, four-walled room full of smoke. There's just got to be a better way. And can you serve food? Why not? Well, so far we can't. Clearly alcohol, no, I agree with that. But how about just water and juices? I mean, they haven't even sorted that out.
I want to get your thoughts on why not alcohol. And I want to play devil's advocate briefly. Lots of people, too many, abuse alcohol and might view cannabis as a way to preserve liver or just, overall harm reduction. But socially, it can be nice if someone's drinking a cocktail and someone else is drinking a cannabis-infused beverage. I mean, it seems like this lounge model prevents that. Is that a good or bad thing in your opinion?
Oh, I'm with you. I mean, I don't see any reason a cannabis lounge couldn't serve alcoholic beverages. Okay. But there is data to suggest that alcohol lowers your inhibitions about cannabis, and you end up with
lots of other things. Yeah.
Yeah. That's for my second podcast. No,
After Hours with Matt Balaker.
Yes, I'll have my DJ voice back then. No, honestly, I believe that there shouldn't be a restriction about that. But if people are smoking cannabis in your lounge, you ought to have an Uber ready for them anyway.
Right,
so,
right.
I mean, overindulgence is probably just going to be part of the byproduct of that. So trying to regulate that is silly, because whether they're smoking in your lounge or not, if they leave your lounge having smoked a couple of joints, then go across the street to have a beer at the bar, the same thing. So right. I don't quite understand. I think the regulators are just they're still following the stigma.
I mean, there might be turf wars with like liquor licenses. If you bought a liquor license 20 years ago, you don't want it diluted.
I don't see that issue here in Colorado. I see more the issue of the regulators don't yet get it. They're not in the third wave. They don't view cannabis like you and I do, that really it's a part of our life. It's something that we're functional stoners, if you will, or we really view it as a part of our diet that would improve our wellness. Maybe we're naturally stressed people, or we have sleep issues, or we have back pain or something chronic. And we take a dose that allows us to function, but really reduces all that stuff that really helps our wellness. And honestly, I applaud my client in New Jersey for taking that approach. On the other side, there is still and New Jersey, when they regulated the industry in writing the regs, they allowed the municipalities to choose whether they wanted it or not. And there's 180 sizable municipalities in the state, and only half of them said, we're going to go rec, we're going to allow this. And only a small number of those said, and we're going to allow cannabis lounges. So you're going to have municipalities that have dispensaries but no lounge. Okay. Jersey City, which is literally across the Hudson River from Wall Street, said anything goes here. So needless to say, I've got a couple of clients there. They've got applications all over the place for dispensary and lounge. You can't have a standalone lounge, but you can have a dispensary lounge where buy it here and smoke it there. And there, in the case of the client I mentioned before, she's going to sort of couple that with webinars on or live lectures on wellness, how cannabis can be part of your everyday life. That's third wave stuff. I have a client there who I'm pretty excited about. He's all but got his license now. He used to run a clothing store for rappers, literally, all the latest apparel and shoes and all that. And he's turning that store literally into his dispensary. It's right downtown in Jersey City. He's a lifelong resident of the town. He can deliver all of his social media friends and anybody remotely involved in cannabis in the Jersey City wide area. That's his market. And it's going to be a paradise for that market because he's got a lounge that's going to be much more focused on the rap scene and the urban environment scene. And I just think that's still second wave, but it's going to do wonders in the market. So I would bet on it. It's a distinct difference between our approach to cannabis, where is it just a party drug? Oh yeah, it is. But is it also sort of a social drug you can have during the day and talk about what usefulness it has in your life? And that's where I think I'm going with the third wave, because as you know, a number of U.S. companies and brands are sort of poised to get into infused beverages very quickly when cannabis is legalized. I mean, Coca-Cola even dabbled with it, going north and testing some of this stuff. So this is going to be very mainstream, and it's going to be on grocery shelves. And in a couple of years, you and I will be able to go into grocery stores and buy infused beverages, and it'll be right next to Mike's Lemonade. You just be able to pick your poison. And I view that as all a positive thing, but I also view that as part of our mainstream acceptance. And there's going to come a time. I've spent my early college days driving from my home in Wisconsin, not commuting, but going to school in New Orleans. And I drove through states in modern times that still had blue laws, where you would go into a restaurant, and if you wanted a drink, you brought your own bottle and you pay them to serve you. And I think that's pretty silly, but unfortunately, I believe that's how the cannabis industry in certain states is still going to evolve. And they just don't get it. And it's going to be this dangerous double weed forever. But in parts of this country that are a little more enlightened about it, we're going to have it as part of our lives. And I view that as the third wave that I wanted to sort of describe. And I think New Jersey, because of when they're getting into it, which is sort of when the industry's at second base, if you will, they're adopting these things right away. And I applaud them for that. And I'm delighted to be at the forefront as their financial consultant on some of this stuff.
Nice. And can you talk to us some about the manufacturing differences between CBD and THC?
Oh, yeah, forever. Not enough coffee in the world. Yeah. Both are heavily regulated, as you know. So they always have to have their labs and manufacturing facilities ready for spot audits. The one I'm working with in New Jersey, they were involved with the CBD lab. The mix of cultures wasn't right. And they've since...
Sorry, what do you mean by that?
The CBD is already in the third wave and has been for a long time. You can now walk into a lot of drugstores, grocery stores. Down in New Mexico, I walk into a Walgreens. You can buy CBD products. You can mail them anywhere. There's not really any stigma about them anymore. And there's just beaucoup articles anywhere anybody wants to look.
It cures everything.
Yeah, it is. And nobody's asking if you're 21 or old. It's
Right.
just there. And it's not even as tamped down as alcohol. So people are accepting this as, oh, yeah, it's just another thing. Well, the manufacturers and the people involved in the hemp industry that are doing this, they have a whole different mindset. The regulatory, environment is just a lot less restrictive. And there's a certain line that they walk that's not nearly as narrow in getting capital. Hemp farms are all over northern Colorado, my state, and we can ship this stuff anywhere. All right, now you move over into the THC environment where I play, and perhaps it's good for me because in heavily regulated environments like this, you're constantly sort of walking these very narrow lines about how you can operate profitably. And many of your listeners are probably familiar with 280E and the accounting requirements of a THC firm where you can't write off your expenses for almost anything. It's taxable.
Yeah, the only write-off is cost of goods, essentially.
Cost of goods is it.
So all operating expenses are just...
Yeah, and while no court cases that I know have been won against if the IRS targets you and comes at you, you're going to lose. But I think that's going to fall away with the Safe Banking Act, but it hasn't yet. Mm-hmm. So we are disadvantaged against other businesses right away for that. For the fact that we can't get normal banking functions and have to operate with lots of cash. So we have to have a lot of security. We have to pay for delivery of cash services. There's a lot of expenses we have as a business that are not really, that puts us at a disadvantage. And Colorado, we went to court several years ago because the IRS and the state were offering discounts to people who'd pay their taxes online. Well, we couldn't do that because we had cash. So we said, this isn't a discount. This is a punishment to the industry. And we won. So that was one of the few court cases that we ever won. And they did away with that. But other than that, we're really behind the eight ball at a disadvantage here. And to maneuver around that and to jerry-rig solutions to be allowed to have normal checking account services has been difficult. But I think that falls into phase 3 too, because right now there are several mainstream banks in New Jersey that will bank us. But just as a depository service, we don't look to get lending function or anything. That's still mostly up to angel investors, which is where I play. And every industry, every state that opens up is starved for capital. Mm-hmm. So, and the restrictions that the regulators put on capital. I mean, when we opened in Colorado, you had to be Uncle Fred and you had to live in Colorado. And then you could finance your nephew to grow. But beyond that, it was very restrictive. And now, at least they've lifted some of those. And so they've gotten capital into the industry. We're still working on that as the MSOs come into the state of New Jersey. They are self-funded. So the industry is getting a boost from that. So I view this as all progress. And what it all means is cannabis is becoming mainstream. It's not yet. There's still a stigma. Still, I'll get phone calls from people that know I'm in the cannabis industry and they immediately lower their voice. And it's absurd. I had a Zoom meeting with a bunch of old classmates from MIT the other day. And many of them still have this Nixonian idea that it's going to go straight. You're going straight to heroin.
Yeah. So right after this interview, you're going to tie off your forearm and mainline some heroin. That's the normal progression.
Well, I'll pump it into my IV here. So.
Oh, perfect. Yeah. There are multiple form factors.
But that's sort of, Matt, I wanted to sort of just touch on what I do so I could move it into why I'm in cannabis and where I think cannabis has evolved and how I believe at the front of the third wave is New Jersey. They've seen all this other stuff. They've seen all this chaos in other states. They're viewing us as sort of the petri dish. And so, we're definitely not doing that.
We believe in you, Jersey. Go for it.
Yeah, exactly. And ironically, just a little quick story. The first and only time I was ever busted for marijuana was in New Jersey when I was moving to Boston to work in the financial district and ultimately go to school there. I got busted in New Jersey, this little town, and they hauled me off to jail. And I spent my
Wait, how did they bust you? Like, what were you doing?
Oh, my brother, I'll blame him.
Sure.
The one that's going to Poland, by the way.
Yeah. Well, he had to make amends.
What?
He had to make make for getting you arrested back in the day.
Yeah, he was driving erratically, and we get pulled over. And of course, our car reeks of it, and I went to joints and then pull up. There was no denying it. So they hauled us off and towed our car, and we had to wait overnight because it was about sundown. Well, the next morning, we're hauled before a judge, and we'd given up all our possessions, and so they knew we had exactly like $150 or whatever it was. So they fined us $100 in court fees and everything. And the tow truck, who I think was the brother-in-law of the judge in this town, charged us exactly $50. So
what a coincidence.
With like $1.50 for change. And I had to go to a Western Union office and get my cousin to wire me some money. But I had to get that expunged a year later to go to MIT. So the stigma was still there, which I think is falling away now, but back in the 80s, that's just what it was. So,
yeah, now it's something you put on a resume. So I'm glad things have changed.
If you'd see my CV, I think my ancestry would be saying, oh, that double weed has got a hold of my kid.
Our sweet Donnie under the spell of the devil's lettuce.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Well, I understand, Don, your brother has kind of atoned for getting you in trouble years ago. He's doing some really good work with Ukrainian refugees and helping them. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yes, he's bringing weed to Poland.
They probably need it more than anyone.
He's sort of, if you're familiar with Hunter Thompson, he and I sort of grew up on the fear and loathing mentality of you take a road trip and it's sort of like an Australian walkabout for us. He and I would take a road trip and clear our minds from whatever issues we had in our lives, and it became sort of a habit for him. And I couldn't go with him, loved to, but I couldn't go with him. But his idea was, hey, this road trip, I want to do something worthwhile. I see all these Ukrainian refugees pouring into Eastern Poland. We have a family friend who's a recently retired police chief in Vienna, Austria. Hans is setting up a truck for them. Rob is going with a couple of other friends on this sort of fear and loathing in Poland. And they're going to fly to Vienna and fill this truck full of Rob's wife is recently left Abbott Laboratories and called them, and they donated a whole bunch of sort of non-prescription, tourniquets and bandages and all this stuff. And Rob's carrying a couple of suitcases with him, and they're going to put that in the truck. They're going to go around to the equivalent of Austrian Goodwill and pick up shoes, clothes, all that stuff, and drive this truck up to the border. And there'll be 3 of them, and they're going to hit the border about 10 miles inside of Poland. They're about 60 U.S. miles from Lviv. So they're on the eastern Polish, western Ukrainian border. And no bombs dropping there or anything, but Rob's just going to spend, it's about a 7-hour drive from Vienna. And he's going to spend 2 days there distributing the stuff and helping what he can. And then anybody that needs a ride west, if they're going anywhere near Vienna, he's just going to he's going to a town called, gosh, I can't pronounce this, but it's on his GoFundMe, which you have, and I think it's Shemsky. And that's a way station. That town is 5,000 or 6,000 people, and they're doubling in size every day. So they got to get those people out of there. They're living in the schools and the churches. And so Rob's going to try and move some of them west. And that's his whole plan.
And we have a link to Rob's organization in the description for this episode. So listeners out there, please contribute. Don,
let's go to this link.
Go to this link, yeah.
No, I'm not soliciting funds for him, but I can assure you that
I will give money. It's a good cause. Please.
Whatever money is given is just going to the refugees. He's already paid for his trip, so he and his buddy are flying, and then Hans in Austria is joining them, and they've already covered their expenses. So it's more about how much they can take to the refugees, and they mostly need, with summer coming, it's not so much jackets and warm weather hot cold weather clothing as much as bandages, aspirins, tampons, just everyday stuff.
Essentials.
At CVS, yeah, that's
Nice.
what they're doing.
Well, that's amazing. Where can people out there learn more about you and what you're doing?
My LinkedIn profile. Just dial up Don Grede. I spell my name Grede. It's pronounced like the Irish Grady, and I'm Dutch. And I invite anybody to contact me that is interested in a quick session on learning about cannabis, investing in it. I do seminars for a number of investment firms that have clients that are interested in getting into the industry. I'd be happy to do that to anyone, just give them a taste of the industry and where I think investment dollars should be put, and just contact me on LinkedIn.
I vouch for Don. He's one of the brightest in the business, so please do that. Don Grede, thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. I appreciate you having me on. I always learn something.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Matt Balaker podcast. To learn more, please check out mattbalaker.com and encourage your friends to like, subscribe, and share. Really appreciate it.